The animal rights organization Animal Rising just released an investigation of the RSPCA Assured scheme, which is the largest and most prominent animal welfare certification in the United Kingdom. But this investigation has implications far beyond one country, because what it shows is that humane animal farming just doesn't exist. So let's watch this video and I'll give you my reactions. But by the end of this video, I think you'll realize if you care truly about preventing cruelty to animals, the only way to do that is to take animals off the table entirely. So let's watch.
We are undertaking the largest investigation into the RSPCA in history, with over 40 farms, over 50 investigators, hundreds of hours of footage, and an official published report. By the end of this video, you will see how the world's oldest and largest animal welfare organization is covering up cruelty on an industrial scale, and how we take matters into our own hands and save an animal from certain death. If, like me, you grew up trusting the RSPCA, this is a video you don't want to miss.
So first thing I want to comment on this is the largest investigation of any animal welfare certification that's ever been done in animal rights history. 45 farms in one investigation and over 50 activists involved in the investigation. Both of those are probably record numbers. And that's incredibly important because typically what the industry does is every time there's an investigation of anything, they always say, oh, it was just one bad day, or at worst, one bad farm. When you're looking at 45 farms, they're all randomly chosen from the RSPCA's website, it shows that this is a systemic problem. The other thing is just the sheer number of activists involved. What Animal Rising is doing is building strategic capacity, because every investigator you get out in the field is building more potential for the future. They're developing skills, experiences, personal stories that they can share with the world. And that's really important for the entire movement, to develop people who have the ability to go into a factory farm or slaughterhouse and show people what's actually happening inside.
So we're just on our way to a laying hen farm. It has around 64,000 hens in this one massive shed.
64,000 animals in one shed. And I think the thing to note about this is the RSPCA on its own website claims they ban factory farms. They are against intensive farming. And 64,000 birds in a single shed is the definition of factory farming. So over the last 15 years of my life, I have walked into pig farms with over 5,000 mother pigs at a single site. I've been at turkey farms where there are over 17,000 turkeys in a single shed. And I've been in egg farms with 200,000 plus animals in a single building, all of which were marketed as certified humane, free range, or responsibly raised. And that's exactly what the RSPCA is doing. The difference in this investigation is in all those cases, it's the companies producing the animal products lying about what's happening. In the RSPCA Assured investigation, it is actually an animal welfare charity that is saying these animals are not being factory farmed. And what Animal Rising found is, while these companies were claiming, and the RSPCA was certifying that they're not using factory farms, in fact, the UK Department of Environment was at the same time listing them as factory farms. In fact, the companies had to seek out permits. They were making statements to the government saying, yes, we're doing a factory farm. So we're going to have to deal with all the water, environmental pollution requirements of a factory farm, while they're telling the public through this certification scheme that they're not, that it's banned.
The most trusted animal charity in the UK is putting their stamp of approval on these farms. If there is an emergency, say red, and then we know that we need to get out of there. Getting a biosuit on, it's just to protect ourselves from spreading any kind of disease.
So you're wondering how the heck Animal Rising got 50 plus activists into factory farms and how they did 45 investigations in about 120 days. The reason is they didn't ask for consent. They just walked right in. And you might be wondering, well, isn't that illegal? In fact, there are various charges that are brought against activists both in the UK and the United States for this sort of non-consensual entry, including, most importantly, trespass, which is usually a misdemeanor, a lower level crime, and burglary, which is usually in the United States and in the United Kingdom and Canada, a felony, a more serious crime. And the difference between trespass and burglary is burglary requires you to enter a building, an enclosed space with a roof and usually 4 walls, with the intent to commit a theft or another crime. If you enter a building without that intent, if you're not planning to steal something when you walk through that door, then typically you can only be charged with trespass. But the important thing to note about all these criminal charges is that there are various defenses to these charges in certain emergency situations. So, for example, if a building is burning to the ground and you enter the building to save a child, you have a legal right to do so under the necessity doctrine and another doctrine called the defense of others. And the argument that Animal Rising is making, that we've made as well, is that when a building is filled with animals who have been tortured and you've contacted the authorities and no one has come to help, we have a similar legal argument, a legal defense to a trespass or burglar or theft charge that entitles us to enter the building and give the animals the help. Crucially, however, you have to show that you had some foreknowledge before you entered the building to suggest there is an animal being tortured. The good thing is in almost all of these factory farms and slaughterhouses, there is a long and atrocious record of animal cruelty and abuse that you can go out there and find just from Google searches.
This is so far removed from what the...
So what you see here at 101 is a hen with a severely mutilated beak, and there are potentially a lot of reasons for this. One is just genetic defects, but most commonly when you see, especially an upper beak that is massively shorter than the lower beak, it's because of something called beak trimming, which is really euphemism for beak mutilation. And what happens is when you have tens of thousands of animals in a crowded shed, they literally have to burn the tips of the birds' beaks off to prevent them from pecking each other to death. They call that beak trimming. But the reality is it's a form of mutilation, which is a crime in the state of California and most states across the United States of America and most countries across the world. And they usually focus on the top part of the beak because the top part is usually the sharper edge that will allow the bird to potentially peck and injure other animals in the very crowded conditions of a factory farm. The downside is if you get it wrong, the animal often struggles to eat. And a lot of animals with deformed beaks will simply starve to death in a factory farm because their quote-unquote beak trimming has gone terribly wrong.
RSPCA show people not what you see in their adverts. The RSPCA Assured scheme is supposed to be the gold standard of British farming, and if this is the best, then I dread to see what the worst is. We just came across this chicken.
So you look at this market and you ask yourself, how the heck can the RSPCA Assured scheme say, we don't use factory farms, the animals have plenty of space? Before they were called RSPCA Assured, they actually called themselves Freedom Food and claimed they gave animals 5 freedoms, including the freedom to engage in natural behavior, the freedom to live without any pain or suffering, which is a freedom I wish I had. I don't want to have any pain or suffering either. And the answer legally and morally is they're not actually allowed to say these things. In fact, false advertising is unlawful in the United States. Under the Poultry Products and Meat Inspection Acts, misbranding is unlawful. You cannot falsely advertise your products, and the government has a legal duty and right to intervene and sue a company when they violate the PPI or the MI, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, or the Meat Inspection Act. There's also a lot of state laws that are being broken when a company engages in false advertising. Most notably, the California Unfair Competition Law, which is Chapter 5, Section 17200, says that unfair competition shall mean and include any unlawful, unfair, or fraudulent business act or practice in unfair, deceptive, untrue, or misleading advertising. All these things are prohibited by California law, and a third party who's been harmed by that false advertising has a right to sue under the unfair competition law. So in short, it's not just the animal cruelty, but the lies about the animal cruelty that are unlawful in the state of California and in most countries across the world.
Who doesn't seem to be able to raise her head normally or straighten her neck.
Yeah, so I've seen many animals like this in factory farms who are kind of unable to right themselves and don't have any coordination. And the veterinary term for this is ataxia. We're actually seeing this a lot with bird flu. You're literally seeing birds of ataxia, the inability to orient themselves in the world, to properly move and coordinate their bodily movements, literally falling from the sky. There was an instance just, I think, last year where I literally saw a seagull just drop from the sky right down in front of me. And she probably had bird flu. And the important thing to note about bird flu is, one, it's extremely dangerous to human beings. So the case fatality rate has been reported, I think, by the WHO and other international health organizations as 56% or higher. Right now, thank God, it's mostly going from birds to humans, and it's not at all going from humans to humans that we've been able to verify yet. but it's still incredibly dangerous to potentially be near a sick animal and for us to be eating all these potentially sick animals because people have gotten bird flu from birds. But the other thing to note about ataxia and bird flu is it almost entirely comes from factory farms. The environment of a factory farm, where you have thousands of sick, distressed animals confined in a very tight amount of space, is a petri dish for a superbug. And this is not just me saying this. This is the most distinguished healthcare professionals, the most prominent researchers of epidemics in the world have described factory farms as incubators for a supervirus. And that's exactly what happened in 1918. And arguably, it's what happened with COVID-19 in 2019 and 2020.
It just looks like so uncomfortable. The fact that they're allowing this to happen to certain species just shows that they're not consistent in their views. If these were dogs, this would not be acceptable to the RSPCA.
Yeah, so there's some really important points here. This is not just cruel and immoral, it's illegal. So under California law, for example, Penal Code 597B says that subjecting an animal to needless suffering or failing to provide an animal proper food, drink, or shelter is a crime in the state of California, and there is no exception for animal agriculture or factory farming. Moreover, there is a requirement that animals are being provided with proper shelter. If you fail to provide an animal proper shelter, that is a crime. And there is, in fact, a proposition that was passed very recently called Proposition 12 that defines what a proper shelter is, and specifically how much space you have to give an animal for them to receive proper shelter. And what Proposition 12 says is that when you, quote, prevent an animal from lying down, standing up, fully extending her limbs, or turning around freely, you're not giving her proper shelter. That is a crime. So what turning around freely means is the animal must be able to complete a circle without any impediment and without touching the side of an enclosure or another animal. And they must be able to do this 18 out of every 24 hours out of the day. If they're not able to turn around and without touching the side of an enclosure or another animal for more than 6 hours a day, that is a crime in the state of California. And what you're seeing in not just this factory farm assured by the RSPCA as giving animals plenty of room to move around is tens of thousands of birds all crowded on perches, in sheds, all day long, to the point that they cannot spread their wings and turn around without touching the side of an enclosure or another animal. So another thing to note about what Rose from Animal Rising just said is this would not be tolerated if this were happening to dogs. I think that's true. If you had tens of thousands of dogs crammed into a shed shoulder to shoulder, most people wouldn't tolerate it. But one thing to note about the law in most nations, including in the United Kingdom and in California and in most states in the United States, is there's typically no difference drawn in the animal cruelty laws between dogs and other animals. So for example, in the state of California, animal for the animal cruelty laws is just defined as, quote, every dumb creature. And in fact, the jury instructions in California don't even say what an animal is. They say it's obvious what an animal is. And one interesting implication of that is even insects, in theory, are protected by the animal cruelty laws in the state of California, because if you look at the biological definition of animal, it does include insects. So in theory, Penal Code 597, which again protects animals from any needless suffering, extends even to insects, because insects are animals, and the law doesn't define animal beyond the common understanding of the term.
The RSPCA often claim that these farms are just one bad apple, but we're seeing time and time again proving that this is not the case. The whole barrel is rotten.
Every time there's an investigation that's done, the companies that sell these awful, cruel products to the public say, oh, it's just one bad apple. Again, what I said at the beginning of this video, where you got one worker kicking an animal, they say, oh, we fired the worker and that one worker was the problem. Or in some cases, we've done investigations where they cut ties with a particular contract farmer, one particular facility out of the tens of thousands of facilities across the country, and say, problem solved, because we had the rotten apple, but the barrel's still good. And one of the really important things about this investigation and the series of investigations that have been done of the most humane animal farms, not just in the United States, but in the UK and Canada and Australia too, is you find time and time again, even when you randomly choose the farm you're investigating, that animals are being horrifically abused in ways that are so unimaginably awful that people can't even bear to look at it. So the point Rose is making in this video, it's not one rotten apple. It's the entire barrel.
And they just keep twitching, and you can tell that they're like just holding on to life.
So when you see animals with their eyes pecked out, with their feathers all missing, crowded against each other, shoulder to shoulder, you might think, oh, this can't be a high welfare farm. But in fact, even under the highest animal welfare standards across the nation and world, so these are RSPCA Assured Farms in California, we have Prop 12 compliant farms, animals are still being intensively farmed, and that is one of the reasons you will see animals trampled to death, crushed to death with their eyes picked out, with their feathers all plucked gone. Because when you are crowded in a space where you can barely even turn around, sometimes you can't turn around at all without touching another animal, guess what? You start trampling and fighting and even eating each other alive. And I'll just give you one concrete example. You might think in California, given that we're now Prop 12 compliant, that pigs are getting plenty of room to roam. That's what most people thought when they checked the yes box in voting in support of Prop 12. You know how much room a typical mother pig is given under Prop 12? It's 24 square feet of space. So that is a 5 foot by 5 foot box. And again, a mother pig is a massive animal. These are animals that are typically 600, 700 pounds. So imagine 2 NFL linemen, the largest human beings on the face of the planet Earth, living in a bathtub their entire lives. There are bathtubs and showers that are bigger than 5 feet by 5 feet. That is a very small amount of space. That's more space than a mother pigs are given in the highest animal welfare state in the entire nation, right? 24 square feet. And so that's why you're seeing in higher welfare farms, animals with their eyes picked out, animals who are trampled to death, animals with broken limbs from being crushed by thousands of other animals, pushed up against them in a shed with sometimes 60, 70, 80, and in California, 200,000 animals, all being certified as humane. In a modern egg farm, even a cage-free humane egg farm, sometimes even marketed as free range, when you have thousands, or in some cases, hundreds of thousands of animals crammed into a single shed, what almost inevitably happens is the animals fight. And fighting spreads like a wildfire. Once 2 animals start fighting, 5 animals get into the fight. Once 5 animals start fighting, 100 animals start getting into a fight. And before you know it, you actually have mass fighting across the entire facility of hundreds of thousands of animals. And the result is injuries, feathers being pecked out, in some cases, even animals being cannibalized. And this is not just animal rights propaganda. You can see this in the actual records, the mortality records inside a factory farm. I've seen it with my own eyes. And yet when we tried to bring this to the attention of the authorities, because forcing animals to live in environments where they're eating each other alive and they're being pecked clean of feathers, that's not just cruel, that's illegal. Instead of trying to stop the cannibalism, the companies have tried to put us in prison for pointing it out. Yeah, I have to say, I love in this video the dramatic shots of the human beings, both investigating and showing compassion for the animals. And we'll see more of that in this video shortly. But to actually change people's minds, it's not enough just to show them cruelty. We have to change their perspective on the relationship we can have with animals. And this is the difference between the politics of sight and the politics of relation. The politics of sight is a theory of change based just on exposure and transparency. If we just show people what actually happens, if there are glass walls in slaughterhouses, that would be enough. This theory has been discredited by, frankly, thousands of years of human history. Human beings have seen, and in some cases directly participated in violence against animals for thousands of years. While transparency is necessary, it's not sufficient. We also have to show people a different relationship with animals, and that is the politics of relation. And one of the powerful things about this video is that it doesn't just show the cruelty in an RSPCA Assured Farms. It shows a different sort of relationship, a relationship where animals aren't commodities, but are friends. Another one of the groundbreaking things about this investigation is that it is the first and most powerful investigation of the experience of individual fish at fish farms. There's been lots of footage of huge crowds of fish in these sea pens, essentially cages for factory farm fish. And there's been a lot of talk about the environmental problems, the massive decline in aquatic life that's been caused by the devastation of the environment and by the cruelty of the fish farming and the fish production industry. But very rarely do you actually get the perspective of an individual fish. And some of the camera work that's done here, including underwater cameras, is mind-blowing because you can see these animals struggling, barely able to breathe, unable to swim properly because they're so weak from the sea lice that are eating their flesh away. And sea lice are a pathogen that develop only in these crowded conditions, usually. I mean, we've got, in some cases, thousands, tens of thousands of animals crowded in a sea pen. These lice can jump from fish to fish. It's like a feeding frenzy for them. And this is why, in many cases, you're seeing these animals with massive chunks of their head missing. But what's most disturbing about this, again, is that this is an RSPCA Assured Farm. Most people think that there are some problems with the way we are producing fish. I think everybody knows about dolphins being killed in nets and trawling and all the devastation of the oceans that's happened over the last few decades. And a lot of people think, all right, well, what we have to do is farm fish and do it in a humane, sustainable way. What they don't know is that this is what it looks like, and this is the experience of the individual animals that are living in these pens. For the record, if you really care about animals, the aquatic animals are a much bigger problem than the land animals, because in the United States alone, for example, there are about 56 billion aquatic animals killed every year in food production compared to 9 to 10 billion land animals. So that's a factor of 5. And if you look globally at wild aquatic animal populations, you have massive declines in aquatic populations. In some cases, 63% or more of fish just disappearing because of all sorts of devastation ecosystems, not just deep sea trawling, but things like deoxygenation of oceans, to the point that a single species of fish, the bristlemouth fish, which is probably the most numerous vertebrate animal on the face of the planet Earth, has probably seen declines in its numbers in the hundreds of trillions to the hundreds of quadrillions. This makes factory farming seem like a drop in the bucket. And if we really care about animal suffering, we have to care about all these hundreds of trillions or hundreds of quadrillions of animals who are suffering immensely, in some cases literally suffocating to death because of our impact on the wild.
That's the worst part about being on investigations, is having to see all of these animals suffering and then having to leave them behind and go home.
When they suffer, I feel that hurts me.
What are the RSPCA doing?
There are a couple things I'll say about this. Just one, I mean, I know that feeling very well. You see a lot of animals in bad shape, and the hen, and that is a hen in an egg-laying farm, with her eyes closed, just covered in filth. And animals are not covered in their own feces and the feces of other animals naturally and normally. They don't want to be in that state. And you see so many animals, even by the industry's own statistics, in a typical egg farm. And it's even worse in cage-free farms and in conventional cage farms, typically. You're going to see 10% of the animals dying every year. And that's a shockingly high rate, right? If 10% of the kids in a school, 10% of the people in a hospital were dying when they entered, 10% of the animals were dying from starvation, from being crushed to death, from disease at a shelter. That's a pretty morbid statistic. And yet that's the reality of what you see. Another thing I want to say about this is this statement that I think it's Alistair makes, when I see them suffer, I suffer too. It's a very important statement, and I think it's actually one of the foundations of animal law. When the animal cruelty laws in the United States were first passed in the mid-19th century, they were passed partly on the grounds of what's called public nuisance. The idea was not even so much that the animals intrinsically mattered. It's going to take a while for us to get to that point. But that people who are watching the animal suffering, so for example, you'd have a horse going down the street, and it used to be the case that most transportation was driven by horses. You'd see a horse going down the street, and the quote-unquote owner of the horse would just be beating that horse mercilessly. And people around that scene would be disturbed. They would suffer too. They would see these animals suffering, and they feel suffering too. And so the initial animal cruelty laws prior to the Civil War were passed not because people thought the animals needed to be protected, but because they wanted to protect their own feelings. But we have to ask the question, if we can feel the animal suffering, and we know that that suffering is so bad, we have to literally criminalize it because of the feeling it's causing in us, what does that tell us about what the animal's feeling?
So we're here in Scotland at Loch Farm, which is a salmon farm. You can see behind me, here are the cages where the salmons are being kept. There's tens of thousands of fish, up to 100,000 fish per ring. This factory farm consists of huge cages where the salmon have to swim in circles for their whole lives.
Yeah, one of the really just amazing things about this fish farming investigation is they just kind of like rolled up there and started shooting. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about factory farming. This is an extremely cost-effective industry that has reduced the cost of, for example, producing a rotisserie chicken at Costco to the point that even in the last few decades of all the inflation, I think a Costco chicken is still $3.99 per chicken. And the way they do that is by cutting down on things like labor. And so, typically at a factory egg farm like Sunrise Farms, where they had 200,000 animals per shed, remember we're cross-examining Mike Weber, and he said, we had 2 employees who work in this building caring for the chickens for 200,000 hens. I think there was something like 2. And so I said, okay, so is it fair to say you've got 1 person for 100,000 hens? And he was like, no, it's 1 per 200,000 because they take different shifts, right? So when you have 1 person trying to supervise 200,000 animals, I'm guessing there might be 1 or 2 employees at this massive fish farming facility. The reality is there's not going to be people there very often. And so you can often just stroll right up and put your cameras down and start rolling. And that's exactly what Animal Rising did.
And the death rates in these farms are incredibly high. I think they said around 40%, but can be as high as 80%. Disease is also rife in these places.
So it's hard to say what exactly is happening with this fish. But the fact that she has multiple lesions on her body, and you can see, her flesh is being eaten away, suggests this is due to the endemic conditions inside the sea pen. The fact that there's so much filth, there's so much sea lice, so many pathogens that the fish are literally being eaten alive.
They can often get big wounds on their skin from the sea lice. It's really heartbreaking.
This is what I was talking
Clearly
about,
in a lot
the
of
sea
pain.
lice.
It's a lot of suffering. We know that naturally they swim thousands of miles back to where they were born. And it's just frightening that this is RSPCA Assured and they're giving the golden tick to places like these that have a pipe to remove all the dead fish. And what's worse is that all the pollution from these farms are just being pumped directly into the Scottish lochs. There's no ethical way to do this. This is the RSPCA, this is the best possible standard. It's just horrific. It's just not fair.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people probably have less sympathy for fish than for other animals, but the scientific research that's come out over the last decade is incredibly compelling, that fish are sentient, and not only are they sentient, but they have particular social relationships. They can identify each other even in a school, so they know the difference between different fish. And it's kind of like human beings from different civilizations or cultures. When you first meet someone from a completely different culture, they all look the same. People always joke that white people can't tell Chinese people from each other. And to be honest, it's kind of true. Like in my experience, a lot of times when you go to an area of the country where there aren't a lot of Chinese people, you see 2 Chinese people, one's like 6'4" and 360 pounds, the other's like 5'2" and 80 pounds. And somehow people just keep confusing the two. It happened to me when I was a law school professor, actually. There were 2 Asian people on the faculty, and people kept confusing us, even though we looked completely different, had different names. We weren't even the same race. One was Filipino, one was Chinese. That's obviously kind of a funny example of something that's a lot more insidious when it comes to fish, which is oftentimes we, even as animal advocates, will look at a species of animal like a fish who's very different from us and not realize the individuality of every one of the animals, the fact that they do have unique experiences and even friendships. And the research on fish sentience and sociality is quite clear on this, that fish feel just like us, and they have friends just like us.
this is Charlie. Yeah, you're going to get taken care of. We've just rescued them from an RSPCA Assured pig farm. They're so sweet. They're beautiful. Hello. We saw this abscess and we really thought that they really needed veterinary care.
Yeah, so what an abscess is basically a wound that becomes infected and then starts filling with pus because the bacteria that's forming the infection spreads uncontrollably. And in a kind of a normal, healthy pig, the immune system is strong enough to fight back and cure the infection. But in these crowded, stress-filled conditions, animals often just don't have a very good immune system. Also, these are very young animals. They often don't get sufficient colostrum because they're not getting milk from the mother's colostrum. Is the very kind of immunologically important compounds that are basically going into the mother's milk in the early stages of nursing that amplify a baby's immune system before they're able to develop the antibodies to fend for themselves. And in these factory farming conditions where the pigs and other mammalian animals are fighting for every drop of milk, where they often are not getting enough food and certainly not getting colostrum. In some cases, they're taken from their mothers before they can even get some colostrum in the first place. Their immune systems are quite weak. But the other thing to note about this is in animal farms, there's nominally a requirement that when an animal has an injury, like an infected cyst, an abscess that's grown to the size of a golf ball, that's pressing on their eye, potentially going to threaten their sight, they are supposed to be removed and treated. In fact, that is one of the requirements of the RSPCA scheme, that when there's an animal who has an injury of this sort, they must be segregated from the other animals and they must receive treatment. You probably already know why that is preposterous, because when you have one human being responsible for potentially tens of thousands of animals, when you have one human being who is not even a veterinarian, who in theory is supposed to treat thousands of animals every year who are going to die, when you know are going to die, again, with no veterinary experience, the odds that any particular animal is going to receive treatment are infinitesimally low. And that's why you see so often animals languishing with wounds like Charlie's.
They weren't going to get it in the farm that they were in.
I've never seen anything in my life that comes close to the horrific conditions that I've seen across these RSPCA Assured Farms. I'm a nurse and it's just not in me to leave them here.
And we can really get her taken care of and give her the life that she truly deserves, not a life in here. You're going somewhere very safe now. Yes, you are.
So you look at this rescue, you look at rescues like this, and you might think, one, these folks are really brave, which is true, they are. The Animal Rising folks have done open rescues across their entire country. We've seen open rescues happen in Australia, the United States, around the world by brave people, including people who worked with me on teams that have been successful at taking these animals from the brink of death. But one of the reasons you might think that these people are brave is because there's a fair chance they're going to be charged. But here's the really important point. We have a legal right to rescue these animals. And fundamentally, the question that's being asked is, are these living beings who are visible to the law, in other words, legal persons, or are they simply commodities who are invisible to the law, in other words, legal property, right? And the important thing to note is that while a lot of people, without a lot of reflection or thought, have deemed animals as mere property under the law, there's no legal basis for that. In fact, there are many principles in law that already recognize animals as something beyond property, including principles that law enforcement use all the time. So the classic example of this that we used in a lot of our legal arguments is that when a law enforcement officer in the United States comes to your door and wants to knock it down and search what's happening inside, they have to get a search warrant. That is a constitutional right under the Bill of Rights. We have a right to privacy that the cops are not allowed to violate. However, there's an exception to the right to be free from search and seizure if a person is in danger inside, for example, your home. And importantly, this exception to the normal right to be free from search and seizure has been repeatedly invoked by law enforcement across the country when an animal is in danger. In other words, the government itself has argued that animals are persons for the purpose of violating our constitutional rights. But if the government is allowed to argue that they can knock down your door and violate your constitutional rights because an animal's in danger, and typically they're doing this to bust some drug gang or something like that, they hear a dog crying in a building, they want to search the building to try and find drugs, and they use it as an excuse and a pretext to knock down your door without a search warrant. If the government is allowed to use this as a pretext, when oftentimes there isn't actually even an animal in danger, then surely ordinary citizens can argue that animals are persons for the purpose of rescuing an animal without violating anyone's constitutional rights, because the right against search and seizure is a right against a government, not against a random third party. And so the idea that animals are legal persons and not property is not nearly as remote as most people think. And in fact, many courts have already expressly contemplated the notion that animals could be persons with a fundamental right to liberty. In fact, when Stephen Wise, a lawyer who is really at the forefront of all this work and taught me most of what I know about animal law, when he brought a case on behalf of two chimps that were confined at a medical center, a research facility in New York, and argued that these monkeys, these chimpanzees are persons who have a right to liberty, well, the highest court in New York ultimately denied the right to free them from that confinement. One of the justices of that court, or judges in that court, Judge Eugene Fahey, wrote a legal opinion where he said, it is arguable whether animals have a fundamental right to liberty, and basically invited animal advocates to make that argument. Because after all, if even the highest court in New York says, I don't know, there's an argument for this, I don't know what the right answer is, that is basically telling us we need to go out and make that argument. And what animal rights and other groups are doing when they rescue animals and they get charged with various criminal offenses for those rescues is making the argument that Judge Fahey invited us to make, that animals are persons, not property, and we go into a facility and give them medical care. We are not stealing property. We're rescuing a sentient being who has legal rights. The other thing to note about this is this has all been done before. So in the 19th century in the United States, there were many Americans who held other human beings in confinement and captivity. In other words, they enslaved them, under the argument that these persons were mere property. And importantly, people like Abraham Lincoln made the opposite argument. He said that the Constitution does not say that slaves are persons, and actually, in many cases, in many ways, Abraham Lincoln's argument was weaker because the Constitution actually does explicitly envision slavery. It talks about slavery expressly. In Article 1, Article 4 of the original U.S. Constitution, they talk about slaves as property. But because Lincoln argued that, look, there are other provisions of the Constitution that say that every person has a right to life and liberty, including the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is part of the Bill of Rights that was passed along with the Constitution when this country was founded, that the provisions of the Constitution that envision slavery are just moot. Because after all, every slave is a person. And if they are a person, they have a fundamental right under the Bill of Rights to their life and to their liberty. And we can make the same argument for animals. In fact, that's what activists did in the 19th century, and that's one of the primary reasons that slavery was ultimately abolished. It wasn't enough for them just to make the argument. They had to bring that argument to life. And that's exactly what people did on the Underground Railroad. They acted as if people were enslaved were persons, not property. They freed them from captivity. And partly for that reason, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and the 13th Amendment came to life.
A lot of the suffering and distress of the animals seen in this video falls inside the RSPCA Assured Scheme standards. We've investigated over 40 RSPCA Assured Farms across the country. Regulation breaches have been common and widespread, showing how difficult...
Two comments about this. The first is that there were over 280 standards and rules and regulations that were violated. 280 that the animal rights investigators found. But the other point to make, again, is that they violated these standards despite the fact that these standards are pathetically low. So, for example, in California, even under Prop 12, this incredibly ambitious animal welfare law, probably the most ambitious animal welfare law in the history of the United States, an egg-laying hen must receive a minimum of 144 square inches. That is 1 square foot of space. Talking about a 3-pound animal, a small dog or a small cat, living on a sheet of paper her entire life. That's all the space that this animal gets. And yet, even these minimal standards are routinely being violated. And we've seen that not just in the United Kingdom, but in the United States at facilities like Sunrise Farms.
Cool that it is for farms to meet these ridiculously low standards. We found pigs dying and dead, lying on the floor. We found chicks dead and dying from starvation and dehydration. Unbearable suffering everywhere we looked. The public trusts the RSPCA to protect animals, when in fact we found the majority of the animals they claim to protect are suffering under this scheme, while they paint this idyllic fairy tale picture of British farming. Things are so bad, we had to rescue animals from RSPCA Assured Farms. We shouldn't be the ones having to rescue animals from the RSPCA. They should be rescuing animals from this industry.
So you might be asking yourself, you have this idyllic shot of chickens running around in pasture. Well, why don't they just do that? Maybe that's the goal. And I'm going to tell you why that doesn't work. First, 80% of all the agricultural land on the entire planet Earth is already being used by animal agriculture. We simply don't have any more land left to feed the increasing population of the planet Earth. Scientists have actually looked at this problem and asked if the rest of the world, which is massively increasing its meat consumption, ate as much meat and other animal products as the average American does, what would happen? Well, literally, we would eat ourselves to death. There literally would not be enough land to feed all the human beings if they ate even as much meat as Americans and Brits do in the year 2024, and the population is increasing. So that's even if people today, all the people today on the planet Earth, just ate as much meat as Americans and Brits do today, we just don't have enough land. Most fundamentally, the problem is when you treat animals like commodities, when you treat them as mere things for human beings and especially corporations to use, it is impossible for you to guarantee their welfare. In the same way that no matter how humane you try to make human slavery, if a human being is just the property of another human being, there's always going to be abuse. In the same way that in the context of child labor, if you have a 7-year-old kid who's working for some big corporation, that 7-year-old kid is always going to be powerless in the face of an adult or a corporation and isn't going to know how to call 911 and figure out how to protect themselves because the kid's 7. And the same is true of non-human animals. As long as you commodify these incredibly vulnerable animals, they will be abused. And this investigation, probably more than any investigation I've ever seen in my life, proves this. Because unlike most of the animal welfare programs in the United States, again, this is an actual animal welfare charity. I think they're trying to do the right thing. They're made up by animal advocates who are investigating and inspecting these farms. And they've actually made a real investment. So on an annual basis, the RSPCA reports that it uses over 4 million pounds. And a pound is like about $1.20. So you can imagine this being $5 million. In 2022, there were dozens of employees working at a cost of $5 million plus US dollars, 4 million pounds in 2022 to investigate these farms. And yet you find 280 plus violations. You find a majority of the farms are factory farms, even though that's technically banned. Well, if you look at the best program in the United States, a program called the Global Animal Partnership, and you've probably seen this at your local Whole Foods, they talk about animal compassion and raising animals in a different way. You know how much GAP spends on an annual basis? It's $1.14 million for a much larger supply chain. In fact, probably 10 times larger supply chain. And unlike the RSPCA, they only have a handful of employees. It's not a dozen employees, it's just a few to try and supervise a 10 times larger system of animal food production. It's not going to work.
We're asking them to drop the Assured scheme and start telling the truth.
Charlie.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
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 Hello, sweetheart. She looks so much better.
So amazing to see her here in the place that she's really meant to be.
This is the very first time that Charlie has seen grass and has been able to put her snout in the dirt.
Considering where she'd come from before, it just makes me so happy to see her in such the perfect environment. She's going to have such a good life here.
I believe we're a nation of animal lovers, and I think if anyone were to see animals suffering like they do on RSPCA Assured Farms, they would rescue those animals. They would want to take them from harm's way. The RSPCA need to drop the Assured scheme, and they need to start telling the truth about animal farming and fishing. We need the RSPCA to be brave and bold and to protect all animals. This is what that looks like.
So this might be the only place in this video where I disagree with animal rising, because the statement that the RSPCA needs to be brave and bold in order to give animals what they deserve isn't necessary. They don't have to be brave and bold. They have to just do what the public already wants them to do. If you look at recent polling data, 63% of Brits in the last year have indicated in surveys they want to phase out factory farming. There have been polls in the United States that have been replicated repeatedly showing that about half of Americans want outright ban slaughterhouses, and 80% of us, 4 out of 5, say that we think farm animal cruelty is a personal moral concern. So the mission of the RSPCA, which is, the literal definition is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, is to prevent cruelty to animals. It's in their name. And that's what most Americans and most Brits want. But the reality is, there is no way to prevent cruelty to animals on a farm. There is no such thing as a humane farm. But actually, let me correct that. I misspoke a little bit, because there is one type of humane farm. And that's a type of farm that the animal rising folks brought Charlie to. It's a farm sanctuary. And when people say they want humane farms, when the RSPCA says we want to prevent cruelty to animals, there is a way to do that, but it is not bigger cages or better deaths. It is not clumsy animal welfare certification schemes that are trying to supervise 10 billion, 50 billion, hundreds of trillions of animals being tortured and killed, annihilated by human civilization and the human relentless consumption of non-human animals for meat, for fur, for laboratory experiments, for many other purposes. The way to prevent cruelty, the way to create a humane animal farm, is to rescue the animals. And this investigation proves that. So I've tried to break down both the legal and moral reasons that this investigation of the RSPCA Assured scheme shows that there's no such thing as a humane animal farm. But I'm really curious what you think. So if you eat animals, if you don't eat animals, if you're an animal rights activist or you're not, tell me what you think. And make sure you hit the subscribe button.
We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.